The first week of school passed in a blur of new routines. Mornings were filled with the smell of toast and the sound of Henry quizzing Emma on spelling words while Jack carefully packed his own backpack. Sandra would drive them down the winding mountain road to the bus stop, a small knot of anxiety in her stomach until she saw the yellow bus safely pull away. Then she and Henry would return to the property and throw themselves into the work. The barn renovation became their shared focus, a physical manifestation of the future they were trying to build. They fell into an easy rhythm. Henry handled the heavy construction, his movements economical and sure as he framed new walls and repaired the roof. Sandra managed the logistics, ordering supplies, tracking their budget, and planning the interior design. They worked side by side for hours, the silence between them comfortable, punctuated by discussions about lumber grades or paint colors. In these moments, the line between their cover story and their reality blurred until it disappeared completely. They were not just pretending to be partners. They were partners in every sense of the word. One afternoon, while they were installing new windows in the barn loft, Henry paused and looked out over the valley. He told Sandra that for the first time in almost a year, he felt like he could breathe. He said the constant fear of being caught had been a weight on his chest. But here, with her, it had started to lift. Sandra felt the same way. The gaping wound left by her divorce had begun to heal, replaced by a sense of purpose she had not felt in years. She was not just hiding from her past. She was building a new life. The children were the center of that new life. Emma came home from school each day, bubbling with stories, her world expanding with new friends and new ideas. Jack remained quiet, but his silence was different now. It was a thoughtful silence, not a fearful one. He started spending his evenings in the barn with Henry, watching him work and asking whispered questions about tools and techniques. He was a natural builder, his small hands surprisingly adept at measuring and cutting. He was finding his voice not just in words, but in creation. One evening, Emma brought home a drawing from school. It showed 4 stick figures standing in front of a big red barn. A tall man, a woman with curly hair, and 2 small children holding hands. Underneath, she had written in careful block letters, "My family." Sandra hung the picture on the refrigerator, her throat tight with an emotion she could not name. It was more than happiness. It was a feeling of rightness, of pieces falling into place after being scattered for far too long. They were becoming what Emma had drawn. They were becoming a family. This new sense of peace made the first sign of trouble even more jarring. It came on a crisp Saturday morning. Sandra was in the garden, pulling the last of the season's vegetables, when she saw an unfamiliar car coming up their road. It was a late-model sedan, clean and out of place on the rugged dirt track. Henry came out of the barn wiping his hands on a rag, his body instantly tense. They had not had an unexpected visitor since the day the marshals came. The car pulled to a stop and a woman got out. She was in her late 40s, dressed in expensive hiking gear that looked brand new. She smiled brightly, a friendly, disarming smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She introduced herself as Carol, their new neighbor. She said she had just bought the old Miller place, the property at the bottom of their road. She was a writer from the city, she explained, looking for some peace and quiet to finish her novel. Sandra forced a smile and introduced herself and Henry. She explained they were renovating the property to open an event venue. Carol seemed fascinated. She asked a dozen questions about their plans, their timeline, and their backgrounds. Her curiosity felt friendly on the surface, but her questions were sharp and specific. She asked Sandra where she had worked before moving to the mountains. She asked Henry what kind of construction he had done in his previous life. This is a moment when a careful heart chooses patience over fear. Henry gave vague answers, saying he had done odd jobs all over the state. Sandra explained she had worked in marketing, a half-truth that felt safer than a complete lie. But Carol kept probing. She mentioned she had lived in Denver for many years. She asked if they knew the city well. She named a neighborhood, the very one where Henry and Lisa had lived with the children. A cold dread washed over Sandra. It could be a coincidence, but it felt like something else. It felt like a test. Carol did not seem to notice their discomfort. She chattered on about her plans for her new property, then said she should let them get back to their work. As she drove away, Sandra and Henry stood frozen, the morning's peaceful atmosphere shattered. The woman's questions were not just neighborly curiosity. They were a targeted search for information. Sandra had to decide if they should retreat into hiding or double down on the life they were so carefully building. That evening, the house was quiet. The children were asleep, but a new tension hung in the air between Sandra and Henry. They sat at the kitchen table, the remains of their dinner untouched. Henry stared out the window into the darkness, his jaw tight. He said Carol was not a writer. He said her hands were too soft, her questions too practiced. He thought she was a private investigator, or worse, a federal agent working undercover. He wanted to run. He said they could pack a few things, take the children, and be gone before dawn. They had done it before. They could disappear again, find another remote town, another way to stay hidden. His fear was a cold, tangible thing in the small room. Sandra understood it. She felt it too. But the thought of leaving, of destroying the home they had just started to build, was unbearable. Sandra argued that running was the worst thing they could do. She said it would confirm any suspicions Carol might have. It would turn them into fugitives again. Their cover story was strong. Their legal paperwork was in order. They had a lawyer. They had a place in the community. She insisted they had to stay and fight. They had to trust in the life they had created. Their argument was quiet but fierce. It was the first time they had truly been at odds. Henry saw the world through the lens of a man who had been hunted. He saw threats in every shadow. Sandra, despite her own past betrayals, still believed in the power of truth and community. She believed that hiding was a temporary solution, but building a life was a permanent one. In the end, they reached a tense compromise. They would stay for now, but they would be more careful than ever. The days that followed were filled with a low-grade hum of anxiety. Every car on the road, every unfamiliar sound in the woods sent a jolt of adrenaline through Sandra. She started checking the locks on the doors and windows multiple times a night. She found herself watching the tree line, just as Henry had done when he first arrived. The feeling of being watched was a constant, unnerving presence. Was it real, or was it just her own fear spiraling out of control? Despite the tension, they had to maintain a facade of normalcy. The annual Town Fall Festival was approaching. Principal Martinez had asked Sandra to help organize the craft fair portion of the event. It was an honor, a sign of her acceptance into the community. To refuse would be suspicious. To accept would put their entire family on public display. Sandra knew they had no choice. They had to participate. Henry agreed, though his reluctance was obvious. They decided to use the festival as an opportunity to promote their new business, the Red Barn Events. Sandra designed a simple booth with photographs of the renovated barn and brochures outlining their services. It was a perfect cover for their presence. They were not hiding. They were entrepreneurs, community members, a normal family. Jack provided an unexpected complication. His art teacher, impressed with the small wooden animals he carved during his free time, Jack provided an unexpected complication. His art teacher, impressed with the small wooden animals he carved during his free time, asked if he would be willing to display a few at the school's table. The request was a source of deep pride for both Henry and Sandra. It was also a source of intense fear. Displaying Jack's work meant displaying Jack. It put a spotlight on the very child who needed to remain in the shadows. They talked late into the night, weighing the risks. To say no would seem strange and protective in a way that might draw more questions than it prevented. To say yes felt like walking their son onto a stage under a searchlight. In the end, they agreed. Jack's growing confidence was too precious to sacrifice to their fear. They would let him show his work. They would stand beside him. They would face whatever came as a family. The morning of the festival arrived bright and cold. A layer of frost covered the valley floor, and the air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Sandra drove them all into town, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The town square was already bustling with people. Neighbors greeted them with warm smiles. Friends of Emma and Jack ran up to say hello. For a few hours, it felt normal. It felt like they belonged. Their booth for the Red Barn events was simple and professional. Sandra had arranged large photographs of the finished event space. Henry had built a small rustic table to hold their brochures. They answered questions and handed out business cards, feeling a genuine sense of accomplishment. They had built this. It was real. Jack stood proudly by the school's art table. His small collection of carved animals, a fox, a bear, and a deer, was arranged on a piece of blue velvet. People stopped to admire them. Jack would not speak to the strangers, but he would nod his thanks, a small shy smile on his face. Sandra watched him from a distance, her heart a painful mix of pride and terror. Then she saw Carol. She was moving through the crowd with an easy grace, her smile as bright and empty as before. She made her way directly to the school's table. She knelt down to look at Jack's carvings. She told him he was very talented. She asked him where he got the wood. Jack pointed toward the mountains that surrounded the town. Carol then turned her attention to Sandra and Henry, who had moved closer. She complimented them on raising such a creative child. Her words were honeyed, but her eyes were sharp. She pulled out her phone. She said she had a nephew who would just love to see these. She asked if she could take a picture of the carvings. Henry's body went rigid. He moved slightly, placing himself between Carol and the children without being obvious. He told her that would be fine. The camera flash felt like a gunshot in the crisp autumn air. Carol smiled and thanked them. She showed them the picture on her screen, a perfect close-up of the wooden fox. She said her nephew would be so impressed. She swiped the screen to put the phone away. In that brief second, Sandra saw the previous photograph in her gallery. It was a picture of Emma and Jack. They were standing at the end of their long dirt road waiting for the school bus. The photo was taken from a distance, partially obscured by pine trees. It was a surveillance photo. Anyone listening in the dark notices a warmer space and keeps it close. The friendly neighbor was an elaborate and cruel deception. Sandra now had to choose between the terror of flight and the danger of confrontation. They packed up the booth in a fog of shared dread. Their hands moved with mechanical efficiency, their words were clipped and functional. They did not speak of what Sandra had seen, not in public, not with the children watching. They smiled at their neighbors. They promised to call a potential client back on Monday. They played the part of a normal family ending a successful day. The drive back up the mountain was silent. Emma chattered about the festival, but her voice seemed to come from a great distance. Jack sat quietly in the back seat, clutching the wooden fox he had decided not to sell. Sandra gripped the steering wheel so hard her fingers ached. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see Carol's sedan following them. The road remained empty. Once inside the house, the pretense shattered. Henry locked the door and drew the curtains. His face was a pale mask of fury and fear. He told Sandra that was it. They were leaving. They would pack what they could carry and be gone before morning. He would not wait for them to come. He would not let them take his children. Sandra felt a wave of nausea. The walls of the home they had so carefully built were closing in on them. She looked at the drawing on the refrigerator. My family. Running meant tearing that picture in half. It meant telling the children that this home, this life, this safety, was another temporary illusion. She told Henry they could not run. She argued that running was an admission of guilt. They had legal documents. They had a lawyer. They had a place in this community. If they disappeared now, it would prove Carol's suspicions. It would trigger a nationwide alert. They would be hunted with more resources than ever before. Staying was their only chance. Their voices were hushed but desperate. It was the same argument as before, but the stakes were now impossibly high. Henry paced the small living room like a caged animal. He said legal documents meant nothing to people who had already decided you were guilty. He had seen the system fail his family once. He would not be foolish enough to trust it again. He went into the bedroom and pulled a duffel bag from the closet. He started throwing clothes inside, a few shirts for himself, the warmest sweaters for the children. Sandra followed him, her heart breaking. She pleaded with him to wait, to think, to give them one more day to make a plan. A small sound made them both freeze. Jack was standing in the doorway of his room. His face was pale and his eyes were wide with a fear that mirrored their own. He had heard everything. He looked at the duffel bag on the bed, then at Sandra's desperate face. He walked slowly toward Henry. He did not say a word. He held out his small hand. In his palm was the little wooden horse, the first gift he had ever given Sandra, the one that symbolized his trust, his acceptance of their new life. He was not giving it to Sandra this time. He was offering it to his father, a silent plea to stay. Henry stared at the small carving. His hands stopped moving. The anger and fear in his face softened into an expression of profound sorrow. This was the home where his son had found his voice. Leaving now might silence him forever. A soft knock sounded at the front door. The sound was quiet, but it echoed through the tense house like a thunderclap. They all froze. Henry quickly and gently pushed Jack back toward his bedroom, whispering for him to stay with his sister. He moved to a window, peering through a crack in the curtains. Sandra's heart hammered against her ribs. She saw a familiar pickup truck parked in the drive. It was not Carol, it was Principal Martinez. Her presence here so late on a Saturday night could only mean trouble. Sandra took a deep breath and opened the door. The principal stood on the porch, her face etched with worry. She apologized for the late hour. She said she would not have come, but she felt she had to. She asked if she could come in. Sandra stepped back, letting her enter the small living room. Henry emerged from the hallway, his expression wary. Principal Martinez did not waste time with small talk. Principal Martinez did not waste time with small talk. She said she was there because a woman named Carol had visited her at the school that afternoon. The woman had claimed to be a freelance journalist, writing a story about how small mountain communities support children from difficult backgrounds. She had asked very specific questions about Emma and Jack. She wanted to know about their previous school records and the details of their parents' tragic accident. The principal explained that her questions felt wrong. They were too invasive, too personal for a general interest story. She said Carol had a coldness in her eyes that did not match her friendly smile. The principal had given her only public information, but the encounter had left her deeply unsettled. She felt a professional and personal duty to warn them. She believed this Carol was not who she claimed to be. Sandra listened, the knot of fear in her stomach slowly unclenching, replaced by a surge of gratitude. This woman was not a threat. She was an ally. She had seen the danger and had come to stand with them. Henry stood beside Sandra, his posture relaxing for the first time since they had left the festival. He looked at Principal Martinez with a new respect. She told them she did not know what the woman wanted, but she advised them to be careful. She said their family had become a valued part of the school community. She would do anything in her power to protect the children. She then placed a small folded piece of paper on the table. It was the business card Carol had given her. It listed a name and a phone number for a fictional magazine. When she left, Sandra and Henry stood in the quiet house, the weight of the day settling around them. The threat was no longer a suspicion. It was a known fact with a name and a face. But they were no longer alone in their knowledge. They had an ally who believed in them. This is a moment when a careful heart chooses patience over fear. The principal's warning had changed everything. They now had a witness who could testify to Carol's deceptive methods. Henry slowly unpacked the duffel bag, returning the children's sweaters to their drawers. His desire to run had been replaced by a quiet resolve. He told Sandra she had been right. Disappearing would only make them look guilty. Their best defense was the truth they had built here, the life the community had seen them create. They agreed their first step was to call Tom Bradley. They needed legal advice. They needed to know how to fight back. Sandra found the lawyer's number and dialed, her hands steady now. She explained everything that had happened. The festival, the photograph on the phone, Carol's visit to the principal. Tom listened without interruption. When Sandra finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he told them Principal Martinez's visit was a critical development. He said they had moved from a position of defense to one where they could potentially go on the offense. He advised them to document everything. Every time they saw Carol, every question she asked, every interaction, no matter how small. He told them to create a log with dates and times. He explained that Carol's actions could be considered harassment or stalking. If they could build a case, they could file for a restraining order. It would be a bold move. It would force Carol to either reveal her true identity and purpose in a court of law or back away. It was a risk, Tom admitted. It would put them under a legal microscope. But it was better than waiting in fear for the other shoe to drop. Sandra felt a surge of courage. The plan was terrifying, but it was a plan. It was action instead of reaction. Henry agreed. He said he was tired of hiding. If a fight was coming, he would rather face it in the light than be ambushed in the dark. Tom told them to gather their documentation and to call him again in 2 days. He would begin researching the legal precedents. After the call, a new kind of quiet settled over the house. It was not the silence of fear, but of preparation. They were a team again, united against a common threat. Sandra went to check on the children. They were both asleep in their beds, Emma curled around a stuffed bear Jack with his hands resting on his chest. They looked peaceful, untouched by the storm gathering around them. She stood in the doorway, watching them breathe. Her love for them was a fierce protective force. It was stronger than her fear. It was stronger than her past failures. Richard had once told her she was too soft, too emotional to handle the real world. He was wrong. He had never seen the strength that came from protecting something you loved more than yourself. The next morning was Sunday. They did not go into town. They stayed home, a fortress on their mountain. The children sensed the change in atmosphere. The frantic fear from the night before was gone, replaced by a calm seriousness. Sandra and Henry explained things simply. They told the children that the woman from the festival was asking too many questions. They said that some people did not understand their family. They assured them that they were safe. They told them that Henry, Sandra, Principal Martinez, and Tom Bradley were all working together to protect them. They presented it as a team effort, a circle of protection around their family. Emma seemed to accept this. She was a practical child who understood the concept of a team. Jack's reaction was different. He listened intently, his dark eyes moving between Sandra's face and Henry's. When they finished, he went to the small box where he kept his carving tools and his blocks of wood. He sat at the kitchen table and began to work. He did not speak. He carved with a concentration that was absolute. Sandra and Henry watched him. They did not interrupt. They understood this was how he processed the world. This was how he found his voice. He worked for hours, sanding and shaping the small piece of pine. The sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows through the windows. The only sounds were the scrape of Jack's knife against the wood and the ticking of the clock. Late in the afternoon, he finished. He held up his creation for them to see. It was not an animal this time. It was a small, intricate carving of their barn. The details were perfect. The crossed timbers of the doors, the window in the loft, the slight sag in the roofline. It was their home captured in a piece of wood. It was a statement. This is where we belong. This is what we will protect. Sandra took the small carving in her hand. It was warm from Jack's work. It felt solid and real. It was more than a symbol of their home. It was a symbol of their resolve. Jack had taken their fear and carved it into a declaration of strength. The wooden horse had been a gift of trust. The wooden barn was a weapon of defiance. That evening they saw Carol again. She did not drive up their road. They saw her through a pair of binoculars Henry had bought for watching wildlife. She was on the ridge across the valley, a small figure standing by her car looking down at their property. She was watching them. The logbook Tom had suggested sat on the table. Sandra opened it and made the first entry. The next 2 days were a masterclass in controlled paranoia. They followed their normal routines for the children's sake. They worked on the barn. They cooked meals. They read bedtime stories. But underneath the surface of normalcy, they were hyper-vigilant. They documented every sign of Carol's presence. The car parked at the bottom of the road. The glint of light off a lens from the opposite ridge. The hang-up calls that came twice a day. Her surveillance was constant but clumsy. It was as if she wanted them to know she was there. It was a psychological game. She was trying to rattle them, trying to force them into making a mistake. But with each passing day, their resolve hardened. They were not the frightened fugitives she thought they were. They were a family defending their home. On Tuesday morning, Sandra called Tom again. She read him the entries from their logbook. He said it was enough. The pattern of surveillance was clear. He told her he was ready to file the petition for a restraining order. He needed her and Henry to come to his office the next day to sign the affidavit. The decision felt momentous. It was a declaration of war. Once they signed those papers, there was no turning back. That night, they sat with the children and explained what was happening. They told them they were going to ask a judge to tell the woman to leave them alone. Emma asked if the judge would be on their side. Henry told her that they hoped so. He said that sometimes you had to stand up and tell your story, even if you were scared. He said that was what brave people did. Jack, who had been listening quietly, reached out and placed his small carved barn in the center of the table. It was their flag, their statement of intent. They were the family of the Red Barn. They would not be moved. The next day they drove to town. The mountains were shrouded in a cold autumn mist. It felt like the world was holding its breath. They left the children with a trusted neighbor, a woman who had become a friend from the school community. It was the first time they had left them with anyone. It was a necessary risk. Tom Bradley's office was in a small historic building on the town square. It was filled with old law books and the smell of paper and leather. Tom was a calming presence. He was steady and serious. He had the papers ready. He went over the affidavit with them line by line. It detailed Carol's actions from her deceptive visit to the school to her constant surveillance. It was a clear and concise account of psychological harassment. Sandra read the words her own fear and anxiety laid bare on the page. Signing it felt like stepping off a cliff. She looked at Henry. He nodded, his face grim but determined. She took the pen and signed her name. Her signature was firm and clear. Henry signed after her. It was done. Tom told him he would file the petition immediately. A hearing would likely be scheduled within the week. Carol would be served with the papers and a temporary order. She would be legally required to stay away from them and the children until the hearing. He warned them that this would escalate things. She would be forced to respond. Her real employers would have to get involved. As they left his office, the mist had started to turn into a light, cold rain. The town square was quiet. They felt exposed, vulnerable. But they also felt a sense of empowerment. They had taken control. They were no longer just waiting for the axe to fall. They had picked up an axe of their own. They picked up the children and drove home. The rain grew heavier, washing the mountain roads clean. When they got back to the property, there was a package on the porch. It was a simple brown cardboard box with no return address. It had not been there when they left. Henry approached it cautiously. He picked it up and shook it gently. Nothing rattled inside. He brought it into the kitchen and placed it on the table. Sandra stood back, keeping the children in the living room. Henry carefully cut the tape with a utility knife and opened the flaps. Inside, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, was a small wooden bird. It was exquisitely carved with delicate feathers and a graceful curve to its wings. It was a style of carving they had never seen before. Tucked beneath the bird was a single folded piece of paper. Henry picked it up and unfolded it. It was a single folded piece of paper. Henry picked it up and unfolded it. He read the words aloud, his voice low and strained. The bird looks east. They know about the boy. Sandra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The boy had to be Jack. But what did they know, and who were they? The message was anonymous, a whisper from the shadows. She took the small wooden bird from the box. It was smooth and light, a perfect representation of a sparrowhawk. The carving was masterful, but the style was unfamiliar. It was not a threat. It felt like a warning. They stood in the silent kitchen, the small bird and the cryptic note, a new mystery at the center of their lives. Henry said the government would not send a message like this. Their methods were official and cold. This was something else, something personal. He looked at Sandra, his eyes dark with a fear she had not seen since the day she found him in the barn. He admitted he had not told her everything about Lisa. He explained that Lisa's parents were still alive. They were a wealthy family from the East Coast who had disowned their daughter years ago. They had disapproved of her work with troubled children and her choice to build a life with a simple carpenter. Lisa had not spoken to them in years, but she had always feared they might try to interfere if something happened to her. Henry had dismissed her fears. He had received no word from them after her death. He had assumed they did not care. Now he was not so sure. The pieces began to fit together in Sandra's mind. The persistent search, the expensive black SUV, a private investigator like Carol. This was not the work of an overburdened government agency. This was the work of wealth and power. They were not just fighting a bureaucratic system. They were fighting a family with endless resources who wanted their grandson. Sandra realized the danger had just changed shape. It was no longer a matter of custody law. It was a matter of a family trying to claim what they believed was theirs. She asked Henry if he thought Lisa's parents had sent the bird. He said he did not know. The message felt like a warning against them, not from them. It meant someone else was watching. Someone who knew about Lisa's family and their intentions. They had a hidden enemy, and now it seemed a hidden ally. They decided not to tell Tom Bradley about the note and the bird. It was too strange, too much like a conspiracy theory. It would muddy the clear legal waters of their harassment claim. They would fight the enemy they could see, and they would wait for the one in the shadows to make another move. Henry took the small bird and the note and hid them in a locked box with their important papers. Stay a little longer, the stove breath grows steadier, and the truth draws nearer. The small wooden bird was not a threat, but a compass pointing to a new kind of danger. They now had to prepare for a war on two fronts without knowing who had sent them the warning. The next morning, a county sheriff's deputy drove up their road. The official vehicle moved slowly, a stark contrast to the unmarked sedan they had grown to expect. Sandra and Henry watched from the porch as the deputy handed a folded document to Carol. They could not hear the words, but Carol snatched the paper from his hand. Her friendly mask was gone, replaced by a look of pure fury. She disappeared inside her rented house, and a moment later, the sedan sped down the mountain road, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. A temporary peace settled over the property. The immediate threat had been legally pushed back. They knew it was not over. It was just a pause in the battle. They spent the day preparing for the hearing. Henry worked on the barn, his hammer blows echoing with a new determination. Sandra organized their documents, creating a neat timeline of events. The children played in the yard, their laughter a fragile sound in the tense air. That evening, Tom Bradley called. He confirmed that Carol had been served. He also confirmed what they already suspected. A high-powered law firm from Denver had contacted the court on her behalf. They were representing Lisa's parents. The hearing would not be a simple matter of harassment. It would be the opening salvo in a full-scale custody war. Tom told them to be prepared for anything. He said the grandparents' lawyers would try to paint Henry as an unstable kidnapper and Sandra as a foolish accomplice. Sandra felt a familiar coldness seep into her bones. It was the same feeling she had during her divorce, the feeling of truth being twisted into a weapon against her. She looked at Henry. He was staring out the window at the darkening mountains. He said they would not win by playing the lawyer's game. They would win by being what they were, a family. The weather turned that night. A fierce wind howled down from the peaks, rattling the old house. The temperature dropped sharply. By dawn, a thick blanket of snow covered the ground. It was the first big storm of the season, arriving weeks earlier than usual. The snow fell heavy and wet, piling up in deep drifts. The power flickered and then died, plunging the house into a dim gray light. They were trapped. The storm was a new kind of enemy. It was impartial and overwhelming. Henry kept the wood stove burning hot. Sandra cooked a simple breakfast of oatmeal on the stovetop. They played board games with the children by the light of a kerosene lamp. They tried to make it an adventure. A cozy day snowed in together. But the anxiety was a constant hum beneath the surface. The hearing was in 2 days. If the snow did not stop, they would never make it down the mountain. Late in the afternoon, Henry went out to clear a path to the woodpile. The snow was almost to his waist. He fought his way through the deep drifts, his breath pluming in the frigid air. When he returned, his face was pale with more than just the cold. He told Sandra there was something on the porch, another package. Sandra went to the door and looked out. A large canvas bag sat on the top step, half buried in new snow. There were no footprints leading to or from it except for Henry's. Whoever had left it must have come and gone before the heaviest part of the storm began. They brought the bag inside and brushed off the snow. It was heavy. Inside they found practical supplies, a 20-pound bag of flour, several large packages of batteries, a new wick for their lamp, and a small hand-cranked radio. Tucked into a side pocket was another small object wrapped in cloth. Anyone listening in the dark notices a warmer space and keeps it close. It was a carving, a small wooden wolf with its head tilted back as if howling at the moon. The storm that trapped them had also brought a strange and specific kindness from an unseen friend. Now they had to survive the isolation while wondering if their ally was a neighbor or a ghost. The storm raged for another full day. The world outside their windows was a swirling vortex of white. They were completely cut off. The hand-cranked radio brought them only static. The silence of the mountain was absolute. They measured their time by the rhythm of the stove, feeding it wood, huddling near its warmth. The house became their entire world. The isolation forced them inward. There were no distractions from the central truth of their situation. They were 4 people in a small wooden house against the wilderness and the law. During the long, dark evening, Sandra found herself telling Henry stories about her Aunt Margaret. She talked about her aunt's resilience, her quiet strength in the face of a lonely life. She said she felt closer to her now than she ever had before. She was living the kind of life Margaret had known, a life of self-reliance and fierce independence. Henry talked about Lisa. He spoke of her passion for her work, her unwavering belief that every child deserved a safe and loving home. He said Lisa would have loved Sandra. She would have admired her courage. Their shared stories wove a new thread into the fabric of their family. They were not just protecting the children. They were honoring the women who had come before them. The children were remarkably calm. They seemed to draw strength from the focused quiet of the adults. Emma spent hours drawing pictures of the snowstorm. Her drawings were not scary. They were beautiful, full of swirling patterns and hidden animals. Jack sat by the fire carving a piece of scrap wood. He was making a tiny replica of the new wolf. He was claiming the mysterious gift as part of their story. On the third morning, they woke to a profound silence. The wind had died. The snow had stopped. A brilliant sun shone from a clear blue sky, turning the landscape into a dazzling expanse of white. The world was reborn. Henry spent the morning clearing the long driveway with the old plow on his truck. It was slow, grueling work. The snow was heavy and deep. By midday, he had cleared a single lane down to the main road. They could get out. As he finished, he noticed something near the bottom of the drive. A set of tracks half filled with wind-blown snow. They were not from an animal. They were from a person wearing snowshoes. The tracks led from the road to a spot near their porch and then back down again. Their secret ally had come on foot in the heart of the storm. They prepared for the trip to town with a quiet sense of purpose. The children would stay with their neighbor again. The risk was necessary. This was a fight for adults. Sandra dressed in a simple dark suit, the same one she had worn to the final hearing of her divorce. Today she was wearing it as armor, not as a shroud. The drive down the mountain was treacherous. The roads were icy and narrow. But the raw beauty of the snow-covered landscape was breathtaking. It felt like they were driving through a clean new world, a world where anything was possible. Sandra held the small wooden barn in her coat pocket. It was a solid reminder of what they were fighting for. The courthouse was a formidable stone building that seemed to absorb the winter light. They met Tom Bradley in the hallway outside the courtroom. He looked tired but resolute. He told them Lisa's parents were there with 2 lawyers from their Denver firm. He said they looked exactly as you would expect, wealthy, powerful, and certain of their victory. As they stood there, a tall man and a severe-looking woman walked past them. They did not look at Sandra or Henry, but their eyes lingered on Tom for a moment. A look of cold dismissal. Sandra knew instinctively that these were the grandparents. They radiated an aura of privilege and entitlement. They saw Henry as nothing more than an obstacle. A piece of inconvenient history to be the courtroom was colder than the mountain air. It was a sterile cold that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the polished wood and indifferent stone. Sandra sat beside Henry at a long table. Her hands were folded in her lap. She could feel the small wooden barn in her pocket, a tiny anchor in a sea of hostility. Across the room, Lisa's parents sat with their legal team. They looked like figures carved from ice, perfect and unmoving. Their wealth was a silent third lawyer in the room. The judge entered, a thin man with a tired face who looked at them all as if they were a problem he had to solve before lunch. The grandparents' lawyer rose to speak. He was a man who moved with the easy confidence of someone who had never lost. His voice was smooth and reasonable. It was the most dangerous thing Sandra had ever heard. He began by painting a picture of a devoted daughter, a brilliant young woman tragically lost. He spoke of her loving parents who only wanted to honor her memory and protect her legacy, her children. Then he turned his attention to Henry. The smooth voice acquired a sharp edge. He described Henry as a rootless drifter, a man who had taken advantage of a vulnerable woman. He twisted Henry's quiet life into a portrait of instability and deceit. He spoke of the months Henry had spent on the run. He used the word kidnapper 3 times. Each one was a physical blow. Sandra felt Henry flinch beside her. Tom Bradley objected. The judge sustained it, but the word still hung in the air, poisonous and persistent. Then the lawyer turned to Sandra. He called her a lonely divorcee, a woman desperate for a ready-made family. He suggested she was emotionally fragile, a victim of Henry's manipulations. He even mentioned her remote mountain property. He painted it as a hideout, a place for a woman hiding from the world, a perfect place to hide stolen children. He was taking every piece of her new life and turning it into evidence against her. Sandra felt the old shame of her divorce rise in her throat, the public humiliation, the feeling of being judged and found wanting. She gripped the small barn in her pocket until her knuckles were white. The lawyer paused for dramatic effect. He told the judge he had evidence of Lisa's true wishes. He produced a document from a leather briefcase. It was a will. He said it was Lisa's will, dated 5 years ago, long before she had met Henry. In it, she named her parents as the legal guardians of any children she might have. He presented it as the final word, the clear and legally binding intention of a woman who had trusted her parents above all others. He said Henry's claims were nothing more than stories, a desperate attempt to justify his criminal actions. The document was a legal ghost, a promise made before love changed everything. Now Sandra had to prove a dead woman's heart was stronger than her old ink. Tom Bradley did not seem rattled. He rose slowly when it was his turn. He did not begin with an attack. He began by building a different kind of picture. He called his first witness. Principal Martinez walked to the stand. She was a picture of calm professionalism. She spoke in a clear, steady voice. She described the children she knew. She talked about Emma's academic progress and her growing confidence. She told the court how Jack had been silent and withdrawn when he first arrived. She described the day he started speaking again. Her voice was filled with a quiet pride. She told the court about Sandra and Henry. She described them as devoted and attentive parents. She talked about their involvement in the school community, their work at the fall festival. She presented them not as fugitives, but as neighbors, as valued members of a small town. Then she told the story of Carol's visit. She described the deceptive questions and the cold feeling the woman gave her. The opposing lawyer objected, calling it hearsay. Tom argued it showed a pattern of harassment and intimidation. The judge allowed it. The principal's testimony was a small warm light in the cold room. It was the truth of daily life pushed up against a wall of legal fiction. Anyone listening in the dark notices a warmer space and keeps it close. Next, Tom called Henry to the stand. Henry walked slowly. He sat straight in the witness chair. He looked directly at Tom, not at the grandparents or their lawyers. He spoke in a low voice, but every word was clear. He did not talk about the law. He talked about love. He described the first time he met Lisa. He told the court about building a swing set for the children in their backyard. He described the smell of the pancakes Lisa made on Sunday mornings. He spoke of Jack's nightmares after his mother died. He described how Emma would hold her brother's hand until he fell back asleep. His testimony was a collection of small, perfect moments, the real substance of a family's life. He did not deny that he had run. He did not deny that he had broken the law. The other lawyer rose for the cross-examination. His questions were like knives. He asked Henry if he thought he was above the law. He asked him why he had not trusted the state to care for the children. He tried to make Henry angry. He wanted the court to see a volatile, unstable man. Henry remained calm. He looked at the lawyer. He said he had made a promise to the woman he loved. He said he had promised to keep her children together and safe. He admitted that he had broken the man's law. But he said he had kept his promise to Lisa. He said he would do it again. His quiet defiance was more powerful than any angry outburst could have been. He was not a kidnapper. He was a father protecting his family. Tom Bradley stood up. He told the judge he had one final piece of evidence to present. It was a sworn affidavit from a witness in Denver. The opposing lawyer immediately objected. He called it a desperate last-minute trick. Tom argued that the witness was an elderly woman in poor health who could not travel. He said her testimony was vital to understanding Lisa's true intentions. The judge hesitated, then agreed to review the document. He warned Tom that it had better be relevant. Tom handed the affidavit to the court clerk, who gave it to the judge. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the pages. His tired expression slowly changed. A flicker of interest, then surprise. He looked up from the paper. He looked at the grandparents. Their faces were still masks of cold composure, but Sandra saw a flicker of fear in the woman's eyes. Tom asked the judge for permission to read a portion of the affidavit into the record. The judge nodded. Tom cleared his throat and read. The affidavit was from a woman named Eleanor Vance, Lisa and Henry's next-door neighbor in Denver. She described them as a happy and devoted family. Then she described a specific afternoon about a month before Lisa died. She had been in her garden. Lisa had called her over. Lisa had a document in her hand. She asked Eleanor to witness her signature. It was a new will. Eleanor watched as Lisa signed it. She watched as a mobile notary who was also present stamped the page. The will explicitly named Henry Jones as the sole guardian of Emma and Jack. The affidavit then described how Lisa put the signed and notarized will into an envelope. She addressed it to her parents. She told Eleanor she was going to mail it. She said it was her last hope of making them understand. She said she wanted them to have a copy so they would know her final wishes were being honored. The courtroom was colder than the mountain air. It was a sterile cold that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the polished wood and indifferent stone. Sandra sat beside Henry at a long table. Her hands were folded in her lap. She could feel the small wooden barn in her pocket, a tiny anchor in a sea of hostility. Across the room, Lisa's parents sat with their legal team. They looked like figures carved from ice, perfect and unmoving. Their wealth was a silent third lawyer in the room. The judge entered, a thin man with a tired face who looked at them all as if they were a problem he had to solve before lunch. The grandparents' lawyer rose to speak. He was a man who moved with the easy confidence of someone who had never lost. His voice was smooth and reasonable. It was the most dangerous thing Sandra had ever heard. He began by painting a picture of a devoted daughter, a brilliant young woman tragically lost. He spoke of her loving parents who only wanted to honor her memory and protect her legacy, her children. Then he turned his attention to Henry. The smooth voice acquired a sharp edge. He described Henry as a rootless drifter, a man who had taken advantage of a vulnerable woman. He twisted Henry's quiet life into a portrait of instability and deceit. He spoke of the months Henry had spent on the run. He used the word kidnapper 3 times. Each one was a physical blow. Sandra felt Henry flinch beside her. Tom Bradley objected. The judge sustained it, but the word still hung in the air, poisonous and persistent. Then the lawyer turned to Sandra. He called her a lonely divorcee, a woman desperate for a ready-made family. He suggested she was emotionally fragile, a victim of Henry's manipulations. He even mentioned her remote mountain property. He painted it as a hideout, a place for a woman hiding from the world, a perfect place to hide stolen children. He was taking every piece of her new life and turning it into evidence against her. Sandra felt the old shame of her divorce rise in her throat, the public humiliation, the feeling of being judged and found wanting. She gripped the small barn in her pocket until her knuckles were white. The lawyer paused for dramatic effect. He told the judge he had evidence of Lisa's true wishes. He produced a document from a leather briefcase. It was a will. He said it was Lisa's will, dated 5 years ago, long before she had met Henry. In it, she named her parents as the legal guardians of any children she might have. He presented it as the final word, the clear and legally binding intention of a woman who had trusted her parents above all others. He said Henry's claims were nothing more than stories, a desperate attempt to justify his criminal actions. The document was a legal ghost, a promise made before love changed everything. Now Sandra had to prove a dead woman's heart was stronger than her old ink. Tom Bradley did not seem rattled. He rose slowly when it was his turn. He did not begin with an attack. He began by building a different kind of picture. He called his first witness. Principal Martinez walked to the stand. She was a picture of calm professionalism. She spoke in a clear, steady voice. She described the children she knew. She talked about Emma's academic progress and her growing confidence. She told the court how Jack had been silent and withdrawn when he first arrived. She described the day he started speaking again. Her voice was filled with a quiet pride. She told the court about Sandra and Henry. She described them as devoted and attentive parents. She talked about their involvement in the school community, their work at the fall festival. She presented them not as fugitives but as neighbors, as valued members of a small town. Then she told the story of Carol's visit. She described the deceptive questions and the cold feeling the woman gave her. The opposing lawyer objected, calling it hearsay. Tom argued it showed a pattern of harassment and intimidation. The judge allowed it. The principal's testimony was a small warm light in the cold room. It was the truth of daily life pushed up against a wall of legal fiction. Next, Tom called Henry to the stand. Henry walked slowly. He sat straight in the witness chair. He looked directly at Tom, not at the grandparents or their lawyers. He spoke in a low voice, but every word was clear. He did not talk about the law. He talked about love. He described the first time he met Lisa. He told the court about building a swing set for the children in their backyard. He described the smell of the pancakes Lisa made on Sunday mornings. He spoke of Jack's nightmares after his mother died. He described how Emma would hold her brother's hand until he fell back asleep. His testimony was a collection of small, perfect moments, the real substance of a family's life. He did not deny that he had run. He did not deny that he had broken the law. The other lawyer rose for the cross-examination. His questions were like knives. He asked Henry if he thought he was above the law. He asked him why he had not trusted the state to care for the children. He tried to make Henry angry. He wanted the court to see a volatile, unstable man. Henry remained calm. He looked at the lawyer. He said he had made a promise to the woman he loved. He said he had promised to keep her children together and safe. He admitted that he had broken the man's law, But he said he had kept his promise to Lisa. He said he would do it again. His quiet defiance was more powerful than any angry outburst could have been. He was not a kidnapper. He was a father protecting his family. Tom Bradley stood up. He told the judge he had one final piece of evidence to present. It was a sworn affidavit from a witness in Denver. The opposing lawyer immediately objected. He called it a desperate last-minute trick. Tom argued that the witness was an elderly woman in poor health who could not travel. He said her testimony was vital to understanding Lisa's true intentions. The judge hesitated, then agreed to review the document. He warned Tom that it had better be relevant. Tom handed the affidavit to the court clerk, who gave it to the judge. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the pages. His tired expression slowly changed. A flicker of interest. Then surprise. He looked up from the paper. He looked at the grandparents. Their faces were still masks of cold composure, but Sandra saw a flicker of fear in the woman's eyes. Tom asked the judge for permission to read a portion of the affidavit into the record. The judge nodded. Tom cleared his throat and read. The affidavit was from a woman named Eleanor Vance, Lisa and Henry's next-door neighbor in Denver. She described them as a happy and devoted family. Then she described a specific afternoon about a month before Lisa died. She had been in her garden. Lisa had called her over. Lisa had a document in her hand. She asked Eleanor to witness her signature. It was a new will. Eleanor watched as Lisa signed it. She watched as a mobile notary who was also present stamped the page. The will explicitly named Henry Jones as the sole guardian of Emma and Jack. The affidavit then described how Lisa put the signed and notarized will into an envelope. She addressed it to her parents. She told Eleanor she was going to mail it. She said it was her last hope of making them understand. She said she wanted them to have a copy so they would know her final wishes were being honored. The grandparents' lawyer was on his feet shouting objections. He called the affidavit a fabrication. He called the witness a senile old woman. The judge slammed his gavel down. The sound cracked through the room. He told the lawyer to sit down. He looked at the grandparents. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight of cold fury. He asked them if they had received that envelope from their daughter. The grandfather looked down at his hands. The grandmother stared straight ahead, her face a mask of stone. She did not answer. The judge did not need an answer. The truth was plain. They had received the new will. They had hidden it. They had lied to the court. He turned his attention back to the matter at hand. The restraining order. He said he had heard enough. He granted the permanent restraining order against Carol and any other agents of the grandparents. He ordered them to stay at least 1,000 feet away from Sandra Henry and the children at all times. His final words were for the grandparents. He told them this was not a custody hearing, but he said that if a custody case were ever brought before him, he would remember their conduct here today. He would remember their deception. He would remember their attempt to subvert their own daughter's dying wish. He banged the gavel one last time. The hearing was over. Sandra felt a wave of dizziness. They had won. The air in the courtroom seemed to thin. She could breathe again. Henry reached for her hand under the table. His grip was tight and steady. Tom Bradley gave them a small, weary smile. They had won. The grandparents swept past them without a word, their faces frozen in disbelief and rage. Sandra and Henry rose on trembling legs, the immense weight of the last few months lifting all at once. Outside, the winter sun felt impossibly bright. The world was theirs again, clean and new. They won. The words echoed in the silence of the truck as they drove away from the courthouse. Sandra felt the tension of the last few months drain out of her, leaving her feeling hollow and light. Henry drove carefully, his knuckles no longer white on the steering wheel. The winter sun was a pale disk in the sky, but it felt warmer than it had any right to be. They had faced the monster, and it had blinked first. The victory was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark lake of what might have been. But for now it was enough. They picked up the children from their neighbor's house. Emma ran to them, her face bright with questions. Jack was more reserved, but he leaned against Sandra's side, a small, solid weight of trust. They did not explain the details of the court hearing. They just told the children that the judge had listened to their story. They said the woman who asked too many questions would not be bothering them anymore. Emma cheered. Jack gave a small, solemn nod. His relief was a quiet thing, but just as profound. That night the house felt different. The locks on the doors seemed less important. The shadows in the corners were just shadows again. Henry built a fire in the stove. and the small house filled with warmth and the smell of pine. Sandra made a simple dinner of soup and fresh bread. They ate at the kitchen table, the four of them. Emma chattered about her day at the neighbor's house. Jack showed them a new carving he had started, a tiny, intricate owl. It felt normal. It was a feeling Sandra had almost forgotten. After the children were asleep, Sandra and Henry sat by the fire. The silence between them was easy and deep. Henry took her hand. He told her she had been right to stay and fight. He admitted his fear had almost made him run again. He said she had shown him what it meant to stand your ground. Sandra shook her head. She told him he was the brave one. He had been protecting the children alone for so long. She had just joined his fight. They were a team. The word felt solid and true. The next morning they woke to a world still covered in snow, but the air was warmer. The thaw had begun. They went back to work on the barn. The project was no longer a desperate cover story. It was a real plan for a real future. The sound of Henry's hammer was a steady, confident rhythm.